The following program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.
Welcome to Science in the Written Word. I'm Lou Massa. We're speaking today to Dr. Roald Hoffman. He is Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Chemistry at Cornell. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1981. Apropos of our title phrase, The Written Word, I mentioned Professor Hoffman as a renowned poet and author. His recent book, The Same and Not the Same, out of Columbia University Press, was critically acclaimed. Today we are speaking to him about his most recent book, published by W.H. Freeman, co-authored with Shira Leibowitz-Schmidt, entitled Old Wine, New Flasks, Reflections on Science and Jewish Tradition. Welcome, Roald. Nice to have you here.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Lou.
I wonder if you could tell us about your co-author, just a word, as to who she is and how perhaps you happened to enter into the collaboration.
Right. Shira is actually an American originally who emigrated to Israel when she was very young, when she finished her college studies in engineering. In fact, she calls herself a lapsed engineer. And she married into one of Israel's prime intellectual, religious, and liberal families. There are not many that are religious and liberal. And she has raised 6 children. She has written extensively. And she's very Orthodox Jewish religious. I come from another pole. I come from a Jewish background, and that's something that figures in this book, but I come from socialists, from another kind of background. Shira and I met about 8 years ago when I went to the university where she was working, and I got an honorary degree, and the rector gave a unusually good introduction, and I congratulated him for it, and he said, I cannot tell a lie, my assistant Shira wrote it. And then we got to talking, we wrote 4 articles, and eventually we wrote this book.
I see, I understand. Let's turn to the book, actually. Do you think you could get us started by reading from the first couple of paragraphs of the book?
Sure. We tell a story, the beginning of the preface, and let me read it. It was a tie. The heavenly vote was split right down the middle. 2 in favor, 2 against. At issue, should man be created? The ministering angels formed parties. Love said, yes, let him be created because he will dispense acts of love. While truth argued, no, let him not be created, he's a complete fake. Righteousness countered, yes, let him be created, because he will do righteous deeds. And peace demurred, let him not be created, for he is one mass of contention. The score was even, love and righteousness in favor, truth and peace against. What did the Lord do? He took truth and hurled it to the ground, smashing it into thousands of jagged pieces. Thus he broke the tie. Now, 2 to 1, man was created. The ministering angels dared to ask the master of the universe, why do you break your emblem truth? For indeed, truth was his seal and emblem. He answered, let truth spring up from the earth. That's actually a quotation from Psalm 85. From then on, truth was dispersed, splintered into fragments like a jigsaw puzzle. While a person might find a piece, it held little meaning until he joined with others who had painstakingly gained different pieces of the puzzle. Only then, slowly and deliberately, could they try to fit their pieces of the truth together to make sense, some sense of things.
Yes. Truth truly is a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? And in particular, science doesn't have all the truth,
No.
And there's some sort of complementary aspect that both religion and science pursue.
And this is a religious parable. It's 2,000 years old. It comes from a genre called midrash, which is commentaries on the Bible. And it's a religious story, an interesting commentary, an alternative or prologue to creation. But it also speaks, it somehow spoke to us, that passage, when we found it, because it sounds, just like you say, like a little bit like science. Incidentally, jigsaw puzzle wasn't used in the initial. That's how we sort of told the story, yes. But it was shattered into pieces, and they are there to be found. And a part of what we have done in this book is to sort of juxtapose these pieces from religion and science, which sometimes people think are different from each other. And we've looked at how religion and science both look at little everyday things, pieces
yes.
of that puzzle.
Yeah. Well, no one really acts, do they, as though science contains the truth, that is all the truth there is. Real people don't behave that way, scientists included, do they?
I don't think real people behave that way at all. Some scientists, when they're pushed into formal positions, like to act sometimes. Some scientists,
as though they do behave.
As if they had the whole truth, and yeah. As if religion was just superstition, which eventually will go away. And then some of them are a little unhappy that after 2 centuries of science, religion shows no sign of going away.
Yes. Could we speak just for a couple of minutes about the format of the book? It's a little bit unusual.
Yes. We have about 8 chapters, and most of the chapters are in some sort of dialogue form. One is a letter exchange between us and a part fictional, part real character. Another one is a play, the first play I have written. I think I'm going to write some more. Another one is a email exchange. A fourth one is a transcript of a courtroom proceedings. Another one is a dialogue between us and some people alive and dead. Now, we did that for a certain reason, many reasons. One is it allowed us a little to keep our own voices, since part of what this book is about is that while Shira and I agree in that there are some commonalities, and I'm, as an atheist, have an awful lot of respect for religion, and actually I think I have some religious feeling underneath. And she, as a very religious person, has a lot of respect for science. But there are oppositions set up between us, oppositions of that, oppositions of man and woman, oppositions about different sort of segments of what Jews in this world believe in. And the dialogue form allowed us to keep our own voices, to disagree sometimes.
Mm-hmm. It reminded me just a bit, I don't think this is too far-fetched, but you may correct me. It reminds me just a little bit of the sort of a Talmudic back and forth, point and counterpoint,
yeah.
And it's something that also exists in the scientific literature to an extent. And I wondered if that was in your consciousness, and whether you were exploring all different ways of bringing this type of argumentation
yeah.
to the reader.
Yeah, there's some of that, very much so. If you go even today up at Yeshiva University and you watch the young men studying, they hear a lecture, then they go up in the study hall and they sit 2 at a table, and they've got the books in front of them, and they're arguing with each other, and you think they're about to cut each other's throats, and they're banging on a table to make some emphasis, but they're really arguing out a point, and then they go out of the room, start talking about the baseball game or something.
Yeah, yeah. The book has something of that spirit in it,
yeah.
you know. Yeah.
It also has some jokes also. I mean,
of course.
It's Shira's fantastic. She's great at writing humorous material. And the other thing is we're not writing a scholarly book here. We think these things are fun, as science is, and as we contend, we don't take ourselves too seriously. So if I'm talking at some point about, we have a chapter about is nature natural, and in it is a discussion of wigs. and we go into the interesting history of why some very religious Jewish women wear wigs. And wigs in themselves are a whole sort of microcosm of natural and unnatural.
Yes.
And even the wigs themselves are made out of synthetics or natural hair, and you pay a premium for the natural hair. Anyway, there we are talking about wigs, and so there's a photograph of me standing, somewhat puzzled, balding as I am, in front of a wig store somewhere in Israel, and I think that sets a little bit the tone of the book.
Yeah.
It's both serious and funny too.
Yeah. In that chapter on where you explore the differences between the natural and the unnatural, you have a very interesting back and forth by means of letters with an idealistic young person who's camped out in the West somewhere on an Indian reservation, rather in the spirit of getting away from science and technology and the unnatural, apparently.
Well, he sets up right away a question which bothers not only young people, but a lot of people, and that is, he says it right away in his first letter. It's an exchange of letters. He says, look, science and religion have conspired to ruin this world. And what he's talking about, we sort of know right away what he's talking about science and technology. But when he's talking about religion, he's referring to the first two chapters of Genesis, where it says man was put upon this earth to dominate it and to subdue it. And he's making a point which some young people are.
Yes.
And we argue with him gently and slowly, and he doesn't quite come around, but then if he would, I don't think it would be a good dramatic scene. But he understands a little bit at the end.
The dialogue gets to this wonderful example, I think, of what's natural about rayon, nylon. Is it obvious that cotton is so much more natural, and so on?
Yes, that was my way of sneaking in a little bit of science in there. And it's an interesting story. We normally think cotton, rayon, nylon, and we normally think cotton's natural and rayon and nylon aren't. The story's much more...
But that's not so obvious, is it?
Yeah, it's not so obvious. First of all, a lot of us have forgotten what rayon is, because we've forgotten that the rag pickers that used to go around from neighborhood to neighborhood in the old immigrant times, and those rags went into the making of rayon. Those rags were from natural fibers, whatever they were, cotton, linen, or such. And rayon is very interesting. It's a semi-synthetic polymer. Today it's made not from rags, but from wood pulp. And that cellulose in a wood pulp is processed by a chemical process in a factory. It's chemically modified a little bit, not much, because what comes out in the rayon at the end is really pretty pure cellulose and not all that different from the cotton chemically. The cotton, sure, it's natural, but it's been treated with herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers so that there is an awful lot of agricultural technique in that, and agriculture itself is a human intervention in a process. In some ways, the most interesting one to trace is nylon, which people say, okay, so rayon maybe came from a tree which was modified, but
nylon is really synthetic.
Nylon's really synthetic. Yeah. Well, I don't think that really probes deeply enough where nylon comes from. Yes, it comes out of a chemical factory, but what went into it? Well, down the line there went in petroleum products of one type or another. And so where does the petroleum come from? Well, it comes eventually from oil, and the oil comes from plants and trees and plants that were turned into petroleum. And in fact, I would say so there's a plant at the beginning of all these things. I would say that if you look at cotton, which came from a plant growing in some Egyptian field, rayon, which came from a tree somewhere in Georgia, let's say, and nylon, which came from petroleum way back from a prehistoric plant, you know, the only one of those plants which really has a right to being called natural in the sense that there was no human intervention at all is the plant that gave rise to nylon.
That's right. The most natural of the products.
The most synthetic.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have a measure of human intervention. What I'd like people, I'm not very preachy about the science in this book, but I'd like people to think a little bit about what they mean when they say natural, unnatural.
Yeah. It's not so totally simple, is it?
Not so simple.
Of course, chemists are the ones preeminently involved in the making of molecules. You point out that, is it a Swiss chemist, I've forgotten, that looked into why hexose sugars, which are, if anything, more common than the pentose sugars, why they were not used in the production by nature of DNA and RNA and so forth.
Yeah, a very great Swiss chemist, Albert Eschenmoser, who's alive today. I use that as a story to sort of part unnatural, but in part to tell a story of how scientists work, that there are these sugars that are used in DNA and RNA, and they happen to have 5-membered rings of carbon and oxygen in them. And much more common are the sugars that taste sweet, and also another way make cellulose and starch, and they have 6-membered rings. So they're called hexoses. The others are called, that are in DNA, are called pentoses. And the hexoses are much more common. So Albert Eschenmoser asks, why did nature choose one and not the other? A question, as there is often at the beginning of science. But then what's interesting is he probes it with experiment, but by constructing DNA molecules built up from those sugars which are not the ones used. They're
By
still
nature.
natural. They're still natural, those sugars. As I said, they're used in starch and cellulose.
Right.
They just happen not to be used in DNA.
Yes.
But he builds up synthetically the world which nature chose not to use in DNA. And I sort of think that's an interesting sort of transgression or probing of the natural-unnatural boundary. And then he finds out that had DNA been made from those molecules, from those sugars, it wouldn't have had this ability to propagate the genetic code.
Yes. It wouldn't have worked, really.
Wouldn't have worked.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You have a chapter that's sort of an outgrowth of this question of natural versus unnatural. It's this chapter in which you ask whether is it possible actually to make a sucka out of an elephant.
Yes.
That is, and it's presented as a kind of material science question, isn't it? It's very playful and humorous.
I use that chapter for something else. We use it for something else. We needed a chapter to introduce the sort of Jewish religious sources, the Talmud, the Bible, which everybody knows, and then the Midrash, this commentaries on the Bible and rabbinic responses. So we took these booths that are built around the festival of Sukkot, and we traced what each of those sources had to say about those booths. And the Talmud, which is not usually known as a book of humor, has this...
Quite a lot of humor there.
It has some humor. Perhaps it's our perception of it, but I don't think so. But it has this discussion among rabbis. It's humor, but it's also a probing of the limits and a probing of the truth through exploring the limits of a concept. So somewhere in Talmud they're given descriptions for the dimensions of these booths. They must be yay tall and have a certain area. Incidentally, some science sneaks in there because the dimensions are given for a square enclosure. But then they explore the question 2,000 years ago, what if someone wants to build it out of a circle? And they come to the conclusion it's okay as long as the circle has the same area as the square. So then they're into geometry, and they need a value of pi, the ratio of the circumference to the circle to the diameter. And they use a pretty lousy estimate. They actually didn't listen to the Greeks around them. And they used 3 instead of The Greeks had a much better one, approximation to 3.14 of 22/7. But anyway, to get back to this sukkah story, the rabbis are sitting there and they're discussing, well, what shall we use for the walls and the roof? And it turns out there is a distinction, which, as you mentioned, has to do with natural, unnatural. And the walls can be made out of anything, but the roof has to be made out of something that is natural but it's no longer alive. That's interesting. How that conclusion is drawn is from the very sketchy biblical prescription is an interesting story. But anyway, they go around discussing whether you can make a side of the sukkah out of an elephant. No one would ever dream of doing that. So why the heck are they talking about
it? Is this testing of the limits, right?
Testing of the limits. One of them says it's okay if the elephant keeps standing for the 7 days of the festival. And it turns out that that's an important point.
Yeah, interesting.
It's fun.
Staying with the notion of the Bible, there's this command: you must not deviate to the left or to the right,
Yeah.
or perhaps it was the other way. You must not deviate
To the right
or the left. I think this deals with authority in first instance, particularly religious authority, but of course it has repercussions into science, actually. But could you just quickly tell us where that phrase comes from? Do you recollect?
Yes. It comes from a biblical phrase about telling people to listen to judges, essentially. And it says, do what the judges tell you, and do not deviate from their command, either to the right or to the left. And I looked at that and I said, well, that's just a metaphor for listen to the judges. And Shira said, no, that's not so. Look, it's really about authority, because I show you another passage where one rabbi, a commentator, Rashi, says you should listen to the judges even if they tell you that the right is left and that the left is right. And all the more so if they tell you that right is right and left is left. But then there's someone who disagrees with him and says, no, you should not listen to the judges if they render a wrong decision. So all of a sudden this becomes a discussion about the authority of judges. What if they're wrong?
Yes.
And she connected it up very cleverly to questions about right and left-handed molecules. It turns out that there are molecules that differ from each other as little as a right hand and from a left hand, and that it matters to life whether it is so. All the amino acids in our body turn out to be left-handed, all the sugars right-handed according to some convention. And when we look at the history of how that concept of right and left was established, we find some interesting stories in science where people's authority to say what is right or left is questioned and has to be demonstrated. And so that chapter uses the right-left theme as a way to ask questions of authority. The first take of people about religion and science is religion is all about authority, and
science is all about the objective truth.
About nothing to do with authority. You just look at the facts and you decide them. But you and I know when we look at a scientific paper, I mean, what's the purpose of all those footnotes in a paper? In part they are, sure, they are useful techniques cited, but also part of that is some establishment of a connection with previous authority. And authority in science is always debated, disputed, claimed, and it's not so obvious that it's just experiment that does it. And in religion, today there are rabbis disagreeing whether in Israel, and it's tearing the country apart, whether they should return for religious reasons some cities that were conquered in a war. This turns out that it happened in biblical times too. And there are people disputing, and one rabbi is disagreeing with another one in entirely a religious tradition. And what's interesting to me is how the discussion goes. How is authority claimed? How is it disputed in both of them? It's not so simple.
Yes. Tell us, if you could, about this wonderful Dutch painting from, I guess, the late 1600s. Van der Werf, would it be?
Yes. In the middle of this science and religion discussion about authority and around right and left, we interject a painting and a discussion. It's a wonderful painting, and it's of a biblical scene, and it has to do with left and right, and has to do with authority. So everything comes into it. Van der Werf was a prominent Dutch painter, and this is a painting of a religious scene, and it's a scene of Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph on his deathbed. And the sons of Joseph are Reuben and Manasseh, and they are brought before Jacob, and he should give the blessing using his dominant right hand, as was traditional, to the oldest son. But what he does is he crosses his hands and puts his right hand on the younger son and his left hand on the oldest son. And Joseph, and this is in the Bible, you can read the passage, Joseph says gently, "Father, you're doing the wrong thing." And his father says, "No, I want to do what is not accustomed, because from him will come the younger son will come
great nations.
Great nations." What's interesting about this is that this is an act, a sort of violation of custom, of authority, if you like, an exercise of authority. It comes at the end of Jacob's life, but there are other episodes at the beginning of Jacob's life of questions of authority. The story of Jacob and Esau, and a deception,
yes,
in terms of an upsetting of an order of things. So it's that's interesting. And then this painting, Jacob van der Werf listens very carefully to the biblical story, and what we do is we take it in another dimension. We take the mirror image of the picture.
Yes, that's what I loved, actually. And we asked the question, can you distinguish
Can you distinguish the mirror images? There's no writing in it.
Yeah.
Were there writing, it would be trivial, but there's no writing in it. Well, if you know the biblical story in detail, you can distinguish. But actually, we take it in another dimension and ask, as a work of art, can you distinguish? And we follow up a story of a Swiss-German art historian, Heinrich Wölfflin, who has pointed out that artworks of the Renaissance especially share a certain reading code, and they can be distinguished right from left just by the way the characters are posed, that the space is used.
Yeah. This resonates with an important topic in science, which is the absolute configuration of a molecule. But we have run out of time, so we'll end it there.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Roald.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The preceding program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.